Have I got a new form factor for you? Today we're going to take a look at the ASRock Deskmini 110. Now, I first saw one of these at Computex, and when I was talking to the people at Computex for ASRock, this was sort of one of the things that I talked to them the longest about. And sort of the situation, if you're not familiar, we did a review on the ASRock B-Box, which is a Cherry Trail processor. It's a very small computer, but it had dual channel memory, which is something that was kind of unusual. If you're not familiar, Intel has been pushing, their next unit of computing, the NUC, which are these small, super portable computers, and with the, die shrink and everything shrinking, you can basically have a desktop computer in the palm of your hand. Well, Cherry Trail is a relatively low power, low horsepower, but also low electrical power usage CPU that ASRock was able to squeeze a lot of horsepower out of, and so did other vendors. And the Intel NUC typically would use a non-desktop processor, some variant, some mobile variant or something like that, and so you would lose a little bit of horsepower. In fact, playing 4K video before the Cherry Trail was difficult to do without dual channel memory. And this dual channel solution that ASRock and others put together gave it enough memory bandwidth in order to be able to play 4K content at 30 hertz. Well, the Deskmini 110 sort of takes that a step further. In talking to them, there was really a lot of interest to use Cherry Trail almost like a desktop, like a living room computer, or a computer that's the family's computer, and it's not really a full computer necessarily, but a relatively low power machine that you could get on the internet with, check your email, that kind of thing. Well, Cherry Trail, Intel ended up not really discontinuing, but that product family is kind of at a dead end. You've got the Core M at the low end now, and then you've got the i3 and the i5 and the i7, which are more desktop parts. Well, enter the Deskmini 110. This is a new form factor STX, and so it's a socketed CPU deal. This is basically an ITX sized motherboard, but there's no PCI Express expansion slot. There's also a case that ASRock provides with this, so you get this sort of as a bare bones kit, kind of like an Intel NUC, except it doesn't come with a processor. It takes a desktop processor, so you can run a desktop CPU in this thing. It's almost no compromises. The only real compromise is that you lose your expansion slot, but if you aren't building a high-end gaming machine, then you don't really need the expansion slot anyway. If you're, building a living room computer, you're building a media center machine, you're building a machine that's sort of shared in your house that you can check your email on or surf on or whatever, or it's going to be a special purpose computer, or you're going to do a computer lab and you need a cheap machine to do a computer lab with, well then these are some of the use cases for this particular platform. So let's take a look. Now, in terms of connectivity at the back here, there's no power supply, at least not an internal one. There's a DC jack that's provided on the STX that is for a low voltage input. The low voltage input basically means that you have an external power brick, kind of like a laptop. And then you've got a DisplayPort connection, DisplayPort 1.2, and then you've got HDMI. These are wired in just like you'd expect from a Skylake motherboard, so whatever a Skylake CPU supports, these connections are going to support. And then we've also got VGA. Now, strictly speaking, Skylake doesn't have VGA, but ASRock is providing this because they figure that there are going to be a lot of business customers and other customers that still have VGA equipment, and they want to be able to hook up VGA. And I'd say that's pretty astute. I think in a lot of small businesses, school computer labs and things like that, they're going to have a lot of ancient VGA monitors. Being able to use the legacy VGA connection is going to save you a few dollars maybe. So it's nice that ASRock included the VGA connection on the motherboard. Now, in addition to the display connectivity, you've got one USB 3.0 port and one USB 2.0 port, and an Intel gigabit LAN connection. Internally, you've got another USB 2.0 header that you could use for some kind of a peripheral, although internally there's really not much physical room inside the case to put peripherals. Now, also, depending on the model that you've got, this thing may have onboard Wi-Fi. Well, it's not really onboard, it's in an M.2 slot, but there'll be connections above the motherboard backplate for your up to a 3x3 configuration on your antennas. So this thing can have 3 antennas on top, so you can use a high performance wireless card if you really want to with this platform. At the front, you've got 2 USB 3.0 connections, one type A and one type C. You've got microphone in, and then you've got audio out. Now, this audio out connection, in the labeling, it also supports the 4-pin version, so you can have both a mic and a headphone cable, like a telephone style cable, in the one audio jack on the bottom, if you have that kind of a need. Now, the chipset on this is an H110. It's got an ASRock H110 STX Intel HD graphics. It has 2 DDR4 SODIMM slots, that's notebook memory. It supports up to 32 gigabytes of memory. It's got a Realtek ALC 283 for the audio. It has an additional M.2 slot for an SSD, so this platform has a total of 2 M.2 slots. One for a wireless card, so it's a very short card. You don't have a lot of room there. And then you've got a longer M.2 slot to be able to run an SSD. So these M.2 slots are keyed differently. Don't think you can stuff 2 SSDs in there or anything like that. You don't physically have room for it either. But you can run an M.2 SSD along with an M.2 Wi-Fi module. It also comes with cabling and hookup so that you can run up to 2.5-inch hard drives. So if you're going to use this as a media center machine, you could put some multi-terabyte mechanical hard drives in there along with an M.2 SSD, or you can mix a 2.5-inch SSD with a 2.5-inch mechanical drive, or you can just get a cheap 2.5-inch SSD and call it a day. Those are all different options that this platform supports. Let's talk for a second about the off-label uses of the ASRock Deskmini. Now look at this thing, it's tiny. It's a 5x5 configuration. You can fit 2.5-inch hard drives in here. Now there's a lot of connectivity and expandability in here, considering that you don't have an expansion slot just through USB 3, just through the internal M.2 slots. I'm going to say that this is really a business class machine. If you have a lot of, Sandy Bridge or older machines in your business, and integrated video is fine. Outfitting these things with i3s or i5s for business class desktops, I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's a small form factor. The power brick is easy to deal with. If you're going to build the ultimate car computer or portable computer, because it's 12 volts DC in, you can have a lot of fun with that. And this is a ridiculous amount of horsepower compared to, doing something like putting a Raspberry Pi in your car or something like that. I mean, Raspberry Pi for most people, if you're going to put a car computer together, would be fine. But if you have the minivan and you need to stream, 3 different videos to 3 different chairs in your car or something like that, this would be a really great platform to do it. But in terms of everyday usage, this thing works really well as a business class desktop, because most people in business, like non-power users in business, wouldn't really need anything more than an i3 or an i5. People for data entry, checking email, things like that. And you can slam 16 gigabytes of RAM in here. So even if you've got a mega tasker that's still really just, checking Outlook and a little bit more than checking Outlook, 16 gigabytes of RAM gives you a lot of headroom. If you put the i5 in here and 16 gigabytes of RAM, I mean, it's a pretty powerful little machine. You can't have dedicated graphics, obviously. It would be nice to see a version of this in the future with Thunderbolt, maybe, because maybe you could use an external Thunderbolt dock, but I don't think that's really what ASRock is going for with this particular SKU. I think this particular SKU, they're going for a relatively low cost, and I was surprised at how low cost this platform is if you want to pick one of these up, and the fact that you can use a regular desktop CPU. I think the other interesting thing here is that other similar small form factor platforms from other vendors do not use a desktop CPU and somehow come out to be more expensive. I mean, it seems like that this would actually be the more expensive option, and so I think that we'll see a sea change in those prices from competing vendors for very small form factor machines. I mean, the Intel NUC is nice, but it's insanely expensive for what it is. And this thing uses real desktop CPUs, so there's not really a performance compromise there. Now for me, I've got to turn it up to 11, right? I mean, that's what I always do. I've been working on an ITX X99 capture rig based around the ASRock X99 ITX. You guys hopefully will get to see that. This thing, because it's got an M.2 slot, I can do the same trick that I did with the ASRock X99 ITX. And that trick was, I've got a dedicated GPU in the X16, but I've used an M.2 and I've broken the M.2 out into a full-size PCI Express by 4 expansion slot. Well, this thing's got an X2. And so if I combine these two things together, this is my Blackmagic 4K capture card. If I combine these things together, I can just 3D print a little sled here that's just going to slap on the back. And then I've got a really, really, really tiny 4K capture rig that can capture 4K at 30 hertz through this Blackmagic card, through this PCI Express by 4 interface through my M.2. Now, will I have to mod the case to do that? Oh yeah, absolutely. But it turns out the side panels, these are removable if you get real creative. So I can remove this side panel and cut a slot basically for my ribbon cable, and then 3D print a card holder or something like that back here if I wanted to be able to run my 4K capture card off of my STX. Now, the particulars of this capture card is it doesn't use a lot of power either, because I have to find a way to supply power to the PCI Express expansion slot, which is through this power connector. And of course, there's no Molex connector inside this thing either. So I do have to do a little bit of soldering, a little bit of custom, pin header work, so I can steal 12 volts from a couple of different 12 volts and 5 volts from a couple of different places on the motherboard. But I've already done it with clip leads and it worked. So that's really exciting because being able to do 4K capture on a rig this small with an i5 CPU is kind of exciting to me. So I like small form factor machines. So if you pick one of these up, let us know what you're going to do with it. Or if you're thinking about picking one of these up, share with the group in the forum, talk about your project, and let us know what your ideas are. And we can help you figure out if this would be a good fit for that project. Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you later.